All right, this is the lecture that I started on Tuesday. Had a few issues with it, so I'm going to do it again here. All right, we'll go through this older stuff quickly. Remember, this is the title you put on it was Later Middle Ages, 1300 to 1450. That should be the title you put on your lecture, your notes. Put in parentheses Unit 1. I'm sorry, it is Unit 1. Put in parentheses Chapter 11. Because this is chapter 11 in the textbook. All right, we skipped the objectives, skipped all this. Remember, this is just an introductory unit, and I had you write that crisis of the later Middle Ages. We did all this. We talked about the gerbil theory, poor sanitation. We made all sorts of connections to what's going on today. Remember, everything that's underlined you need to have written down. See if I can get this. Yeah, here we go. Pretty cool animated map here. Of course, anything you'll find on the internet is suspect to not being accurate. All right, so I didn't make you write this. We did talk about Florence being the birthplace of the Renaissance. Few kids in my earlier, third period knew that. Apparently nobody in seventh period knew that. Well, we'll see how it goes as the year goes along. Anyway, we talked about this, I believe. The economy in the towns was hit worse than in the countryside. We talked about how that's pretty much been the same here in Florida. I did find out since Tuesday, this is Wednesday when I'm recording this, I did find out since yesterday, Tuesday, that the person that I went to school with in high school that's very ill does not have COVID. But I do have my wife and I have a very close family member who does, and is quite sick. Anyway, we talked about that, very important there. They enjoyed higher wages, the ones that were still alive. We talked about serfdom and major peasant revolts. And I think I mentioned this. You see them starting to enclose the fields. And I mentioned this is later on going to be a major deal in the 1600s, the so-called enclosure movement. This is not, we shouldn't really associate this ancient period here with the enclosure movement, but it is an early enclosure. The best of the clergy died. The Jews were blamed. Many of them were burned alive and tortured. And I believe this is where I ended up with one class, maybe both classes. All right, and so you see here that Northern Europe developed this morbid fascination with it. Okay, so anyway, I like to tell stories. I'm pretty good at finding stuff on Google, but I always have students that are better than I am. And I told the story in class one year about the Mongols. Now, the Mongols we don't really cover in Euro. That's an AP World thing. But the Mongols, a lot of you are juniors and seniors. You remember your AP World teacher talking about them. The Mongols were famous for down in the Crimea. They would surround these cities, and the Mongols, their thing was they'd give you a chance to surrender. Then if you didn't, they would come in and get you. And so what happened was, I hope this video works, by the way. What happened was they would take people who died of the plague, cut their heads off, and put them in catapults, and fling them over the walls into the cities, that they were attacking, that they'd laid siege to. And I had a student, let's see if this is going to work. Oh, no, it's not going to work. All right, I have the video somewhere. It is a video from a YouTube video from The Lord of the Rings, and where they do that anyway. So moving on here. This is the Crimea, and we're going to talk about this area quite a bit. This area here, this is the Black Sea. So Russia's over here, the Ukraine's up here. This is the Crimean Peninsula, which belonged to Russia for many, many years, and then the Soviet Union. And when communism failed, socialism failed in, I guess, 1992, the Ukraine broke off from the old Soviet Union as the Soviet Union collapsed. And anyway, the Russians invaded the Crimean Peninsula, I'm not sure, 2014, 2015, when that was, and took it back. It was just after the Olympics. The Olympics, I can't read these. The Olympics were in Sochi that year. It was a big deal, kind of a diplomatic showdown between Putin and Obama, and as soon as the Olympics were over, the Russians invaded the Ukraine. I'm sorry, they invaded the Crimean Peninsula and took it over, and since then have put pressure on the Ukraine. Anyway, moving on. Let's see what this is. Nothing. All right. Okay, the next topic, and this is a major topic, is the 100 Years' War. Okay? And what it was is England, obviously, is out in the ocean off from the European continent, but there's a long-running connection between England and France. And for many years, the English controlled part of France. And there was a region in France called Aquitaine. And so what happened was the English king and the French king both claimed it. And so what happened was this French king took it, and the English king went to war over it. So it's kind of interesting. We think today in terms of England's on, out here on this huge island, and then France is part of Europe, but borders were more fluid back then. And so they went to war over Aquitaine. Be prepared if I give you a multiple choice test to see a question on Aquitaine being the cause of the 100 Years' War. This is all pre-modern European history, but you get points for making connections. And Joan of Arc is one of the most famous females in European history, and you all have heard of her, I'm sure. She was a peasant girl who claimed she heard voices from, it says here, the saints, and she got the French king. Now, she was French. She went to the French king, and the French were basically losing the war at that time. And they had been. The French have lost a lot of wars to English. I tend to make lots of jokes about that. I think all AP European teachers do. But again, until I have you guys in person and you know my sense of humor, I'll try to I've got some good jokes about that. But anyway, I think they're good. But anyway, moving on. So she goes to the French king and she goes, hey, I'm hearing voices. Please, follow me and I will lead you to victory. And they do. And I always make jokes about this. Imagine if you are a person and you go to the White House and demand to see the president and say you're hearing voices. I have been to the White House, and I can tell you that when we went through the security, now this was before 9/11, security is much tougher now. We went through security, my belt buckle set off, the metal detector, I think I had to go through 4 metal detectors. I think everyone did. And it's pretty seriously intimidating. All these Secret Service men looking at you because you keep setting the alarms off. Anyway, quite intimidating. Just imagine someone trying to go up there to see the president, claiming they're hearing voices. Anyway, you can write all this down. She led them to victory, and she was later burned at the stake by the English. Now, one point I want to make is would be easy to make this seem like this was a war between the English and the French, but some of the people that we would consider French are fighting on the side of the English. And if I remember the story correctly, there's usually at least one kid in the class who knows everything there is to know about Joan of Arc. By the way, again, I only know a few of you this year, you AP European students. Normally I know half the class because they all came out of AP World. And last year I only had one AP World period. And so I only had, I try to explain to them the more AP World classes I have, the more likely I'm to have big European classes. I don't want to stress that too much because I really enjoy teaching AP Economics, AP Macroeconomics, and if I go down there and stress, hey, I need more AP World classes, they'll take away more of my macro classes. Although I do have to say one thing about teaching macro is nobody wants my job. I mean, there are people who I'm sure who would love to teach AP European history. There are definitely people who love to teach AP World history. There's pretty much nobody out there who wants to teach AP macro. I love it. I guess I'm a little weird. Anyway, so the think back to Joan of Arc here is there were some French. I'm just saying some of you may be a big fan of Joan of Arc and know a lot. I remember I had a girl one year who knew everything about her. So I may get part of this story wrong, and this is going to happen all year long, where I run up on a topic that you're very, very knowledgeable in. And if I make a mistake, I would like, to know about it. I don't want you to be rude about it. But this class is a learning experience for you and me both. And I've learned a lot from super, super intelligent students. Hopefully, most of my students have learned a lot from me. But anyway, here's the thing, is I remember she was captured by French people who gave her, French people hostile to the French king. So this is all about a concept we're going to talk about in the next chapter called balance of power. These French nobles did not like the French king. And in fact, during this time, France wasn't really what we would call a country. It was a collection of regions or provinces, whatever word you want to use. There's going to be a lot of that we're going to cover. I have a hard time explaining to many people that the United States was really set up to be 13 different countries. And some of you who are following politics know there's this big, huge argument about states' rights. And the Civil War was also largely about states' rights. I'm not saying it wasn't about slavery, because the way my history professor explained it to me, the Civil War was over states' rights. But the biggest, most troublesome state right was the issue of slavery. So it's way more complicated than that. I'll leave that to your very capable and knowledgeable A-Push teachers. We have two good ones here. Anyway, at Apopka High. So anyway, there's a bit of a struggle going on, so they betray her. Here's the interesting thing I want you to know about her, is she supposedly said what she was doing for the glory of France. And I kind of doubt this is true, but legend has it she was, and you want to write this in your notes. I tell kids all the time, don't write just what's on the screen. Take notes on what I'm saying in the margins. So put this in the margins. She is supposedly the first to have said the word France. So she's seen in history as kind of a unifier. Okay? Well, so much for that graphic. I should have really previewed. I have to do 3 of these videos tonight. Pretty much an hour's work for AP World, AP Euro, and AP Macro. And it looks like I'll be doing it that way up until next Friday when we start school. Results of the 100 Years' War, and here's where it gets, it's going to get significant. France has permanently removed England from France, except the Pas de Calais, or the port of Calais. And they call this the modernization of state building. I'm going to throw some other things in here. I want you to write in your notes, add this to your notes. Like I said, I'm going to do this a lot. It's supposedly the end of the Middle Ages or the end of feudalism. And it is supposedly, I'm tempted to call it the first modern war, but that is the Crimean War. There's something else significant about the weaponry here, and it's supposedly the end of chivalry. Apparently, this is the war where the Europeans really started using cannons. And so I hope you're listening to my lecture here and writing this stuff down. The Middle Ages is really about the code of chivalry. And what these knights would do is they would go out in the open and they would fight it out, man to man, and for the bravery and the honor and all that, and the credit. Well, if you go out there in the middle of the field and you start waving your sword around, and they're sitting there on the other side with the cannon, you're not going to be anything but a greasy spot. So that's why I guess they would say this is the end of feudalism, the end of the Middle Ages. Skipping that. All right. And I want you to go ahead and write this down here. And I'm going to, what you probably ought to do is just pause the video and write this. But you're going to notice a pattern here again. And that's what largely history is about, is learning patterns. You have this huge war. Oh, by the way, the French won. The French won. And the English are famous for using these longbows. And the French used the crossbows. I'm sure there was some crossover, but the English longbow is very, very famous. There's a story I tell, which is kind of a joke, which I am not going to tell on videotape. There's no profanity or anything like that. I don't tell bad jokes, but stuff just doesn't come over right on video without facial expressions. But anyway, hopefully you've written all this down. All right, very important here, because the way AP European history is structured as a course is the first major thing you cover in AP European history is the Renaissance. Okay? The second major thing you cover is the Reformation. And what's going on with the Reformation is what you see right here. So as much as I like talking about the Black Death, this section here on the Catholic Church is probably much more important, because what you're going to find is this is the precursor to the Reformation. And you are extremely likely to get an AP essay on the Reformation. It's probably the most tested topic in European history. One of the highest honors I ever got from any of my students, I had a student, it's kind of interesting. He used to be my next door neighbor, and I still am Facebook friends with him and his parents. And he took my AP Geography class. He took my AP World class. He took my AP European class. In his senior year, he'd taken me 3 years in a row. I had a movie class. Now, I don't know which room I'm going to be in when school starts, but if you go look in my old room, I still have my old movie posters up. And I probably will, when they give me room, bring them in, because I've had them on my walls for like 12 years. I'm not very creative in that way. But this kid, he had a shot at being valedictorian. And his guidance counselor called him down, and she said, Mr. Russell's film class is a red class. If you take that red class, it's going to drop your GPA so that you won't be valedictorian, salutatorian. And he said 3 words, I don't care. Then he went on to say, I want to be in his class. And this kid was a genius. So he graduated number 3 in his senior class. And clearly I taught all 3, I taught the valedictorian and salutatorian too. They were all geniuses. They were in the only AP Geography class I ever had. But anyway, he went out to Tulane, was where he went to college. And when he went out there to visit, he went to a European history lecture. And I said, oh no. I said, you sat in with a real PhD. He goes, yes. He goes, the guy spent the entire lecture talking about Luther. And I said, oh man, tell me what you learned. And he paid me probably the greatest compliment I've ever had as a teacher. He goes, I didn't learn really anything. You taught me everything I need to know about Luther. That's how important Luther in the Protestant Reformation is. All right, so background, crisis in the Catholic Church. By the way, the word Catholic means universal. Now, I don't know how many of you are sophomores. I need to look up and see how many of you are so I can quit saying that. But you should have got a grounding in the Protestant Reformation somewhat in AP World History. Believe me, you're going to get it in this class. But the Catholic Church, the word Catholic means universal, and it really just means, universal Christian church. There really was no other church in Europe except over in Eastern Europe. There was the remnants of the old Byzantine Empire, which there was the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, and there were some variations there. But in Western Europe, this was the dominant institution. And there you go. They said it pretty good here. Western and Central Europe are dominated by the Catholic Church. And so if you were in a country, remember, there really aren't countries. They're they're city-states or something like that. They're regions, and they would have dukes and earls. It might behoove me one day to spend some time on feudalism so you understand what is ending. This is the end of feudalism, and maybe I'll do that. I'm assuming that your AP World History teacher, there were 4 of us last year, and I don't know about the other 2, but I can tell you, Anshel and I would have done we would have done feudalism in AP World History to a T. We'd have done everything in it. But of course, some of you are sophomores and haven't had it yet. But anyway, so you'd have a local lord. Well, the bishop or archbishop in that area was probably more powerful. And the most powerful political figures in Europe generally were popes. Now, I know they're supposed to be religious leaders, but many of them were quite secular and not really interested in Christianity or anything like that. And if you're Catholic, please don't be offended. I think if you go ask your priest, I've known some Catholic priests are highly educated. They will tell you that I'm telling you the truth. There was a time of what they call the secular popes. And boy, do I have some stories about them. Anyway, The Middle Ages were characterized by religious unity under the Catholic Church. Not political unity, but religious. And inasmuch as the Pope was a political leader, he could mediate, peace between warring monarchs if they were Catholics. Generally, not all the time. All right, here we go. This is actually, remember, this is not my written lecture. I bought these from a guy for, I think, $180. Later on, when you start to take your unit tests, I will give you his notes to study. This is usually the only one of his lectures I do anymore. All right, now, here's some names you really need to know. Some of these guys I know a lot about, and some of them I don't know a lot about. This is one of the ones I really don't know much about. The reason we give you the names is, again, if you get an essay on the Catholic Church or the Reformation, you can talk about these guys and get points. And you can get points on your essays. And remember, two of your essays, the DBQ and the LEQ, start with contextualization. So you have 2 points of your essays writing on, can you tell the reader what happened before the topic you're talking about? And I just said this in my AP World lecture, and I'll say it here too. I've been coaching for over 20 years. There's plenty of, if 1 point doesn't seem like a lot to you, I've lost numerous games and meets by 1 point, and won numerous games and meets by 1 point. So if there's any athletes in the room, you know exactly how important 1 point can be. He claimed the church should be subordinate to the state. So that's what he's famous for. And he believed the church should be governed by a council. Now this is very important. Hopefully this thing will come in a minute. This is called the consular movement. The idea that a group of people should be in charge, not one person. By the way, this is AP European history. I give you guys, I got to tell you this, I have a master's degree in European history, and I don't mean to be insulting you or anything, but I consider this my flagship class. I consider this a class, very intellectual class, and I usually get the smartest kids on campus. My pass rate was so high last year, it was the highest in my teaching career, period, for any AP class ever. It's so high, normally I have a deal with my students. I will tell them what my pass rate is, whether it's good or it's bad. I'll tell you. My AP macro pass rate, I'm not 100% proud of it, but it was 46%. Probably sounds horrible to you, but generally a 46% pass rate in macro is considered pretty good. AP World, I also had the highest pass rate I'd ever had in AP World. I'll tell you that when it was 75%. My pass rate in Europe was so high, it's pretty much embarrassing. But anyway, it wasn't a normal year. But I'm just going to tell you that I get a lot of smart kids in here, so I'm going to definitely go the extra mile. Okay? I'm going to go the extra mile and give you extra stuff. I do that in macro and world too. So I'm not giving you something I don't give them, but I probably give you guys more. So let's talk about where the concept of the Pope comes from. Okay? And by the way, if you're uncomfortable talking about religion, especially Christianity, this may be a tough class. But I will say most of the religious stuff is done by Unit 1. So if you're offended by that, it'll be over. There's 4 units in AP World History. Anyway, so here's the deal. So there's Jesus, and he's got how many disciples? If I was in class, I'd ask you, and I'm assuming you would know that there were 12. And there's a lot of corporate boards, and there's a lot of groups that are dominated by councils of 12, just because I guess people use the biblical example. And so anyway, one day Jesus had 12 disciples, but there were 3 who were I hate to use the word. By the way, I grew up in church. My mother is a ordained Pentecostal minister. I went to Oral Roberts University. If you watched my biography, you know that. So I have a very grounded scriptural and theological Christian background. Okay? And so the deal is, so some of you know these stories, some of you don't, but he had 12 disciples, but it's kind of like he had 3 favorites. Okay? And there's that number 3, which is so often associated with the Godhead or the Trinity. And so he had three, Peter, James, and John, that he loved the most and he was with the most. So one day he says to his disciples, he says, people are saying a lot of stuff about me. I'm putting it in my own Russell redneck terms. People are saying a lot about me. What are they saying? And they said, well, some people say you're doing these deeds because you're full of the devil. Some people say you are crazy. Some people say you are the Son of God. There was actually a song written once called Lord, Liar, or Lunatic. And so Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter, who was very loudmouthed and bold and brash, supposedly jumped to his feet and said, you're the Son of the living God. And Jesus told him, you're the rock on which I will build my church. And the word Peter actually means rock. And so so here's where this gets controversial. And if you think I'm off topic, I am not off topic at all. Off topic is when I am talking about something that has nothing to do with what I'm supposed to be talking about. This sounds like I'm off topic, but I am absolutely not. So, because we're going to get to some of the differences when we get to the Reformation between the Protestants and the Catholics. And so here's a big difference. The Catholics teach that when Jesus gave that office, or that, I don't know, the word blessing is not there, that prophetic word to Peter, that office that Peter holds can be passed down. And so the current Pope is the spiritual descendant of Peter. Whereas the Protestants believe that he gave that job to Peter and not to anybody else. They don't believe that was a job that can be passed down. And so the Protestants do not accept the authority of the Pope. The Russian Orthodox Church, by the way, has a leader as well called the Metropolitan. Anyway, so just want you to understand that. So this is a Catholic council is what this is. It's a group of Catholics that think there shouldn't be one man in charge. There should be a council. And this may seem common sense to you. You know, if you study the business world, you know about concepts like the board of directors. But this was, and I'm using this word on purpose, and if you're writing this in your notes, you might want to underline this. This was revolutionary for the Catholics to be pushing this idea that there should be a council instead of one person. Or, let me go back, or that the Pope would exist, but he would be inferior to the council. The council would be superior. So it doesn't mean necessarily they were trying to get rid of the Pope, but it is a controversial, revolutionary idea. All right, moving on to the next slide. John Wycliffe. And I've seen this spelled different ways. I honestly thought it was Wycliffe. And I have, as always with everything, a story to tell. And I tell this story every year, and I'll ask the kids, 3 weeks later, do you remember the story? And for some reason, there's stories of mine that I tell them, like the Tiger Woods story when I'm talking about Buddhism. Their stories, that's an AP World story. Their stories I tell them, they seem never to forget. This is one they never seem to remember. But I went to a religious school, Oral Roberts University, and I was sitting in the lunchroom one day, my senior year, and there was an old guy there, and I'm friendly. I was 20 years old when I was a senior. I might have been 19. When I started my senior year, I was 19, and it's possible I was 19. I walked over and sat down and just started visiting with the guy, and I said, what are you doing? He goes, I'm here on campus interviewing for my company, and I said, well, I'm a senior. I might be looking for a job. What does your company do? And he goes, I work for Wycliffe Bible Translators. I'd never heard of them, which is not surprising. I was an accounting major. I wasn't a religion or a theology major. And he told me, he says, what we do is we hire college students. This was fascinating to me. He goes, we hire kids straight out of college, and we send them to some remote area on the globe because we believe Jesus is not coming back until the gospel is preached all over the world. And he goes, and so what we do is we will send a missionary to some remote village, say on the Amazon, with some people that have their own language, and we send that missionary there, and they live there for 2 years. I think he said 2 years. This has been 40 years ago that this happened. he goes, he lives there for 2 years, and in that time he becomes fluent in the reading and writing of their language, and he or she, they're women too. He goes, and they, before they leave, they will translate the Bible into their language. And he said, that is our goal to, and I knew by this point I was not interested in the job. I don't want to go live, and you know, I just, at the time I didn't, and to be honest with you, I'm not being rude or anything. I don't really want to do that now either. But, he said, we do that, and our goal is to translate the Bible into every language spoken on earth. And I asked him how much they paid him, and he's like, it's way less than minimum wage. And so I had just kind of, I've never forgotten that story. And about 10 years ago, we had, as you know, I'm a coach, a new athletic translator, a new athletic director in charge of all the coaches here at Apopka High School. And I was talking to him one day, and he told me his wife works for Wycliffe Bible translators, and their headquarters, I find very fascinating now, is here in Orlando. Anyway, that's my tie-in to the name Wycliffe. But we're actually now talking about not the organization, the actual man. And here's what this guy said. Again, these guys are hugely important. He said, now remember, these guys are, if they're not Catholics, they're pretty close, because the Catholic Church was pretty much the only thing they had back then. There were some people kind of going their independent way inside the Catholic Church, and these people, that's what these guys are doing. But he said, listen, you know, we should only do what the Bible says, the Scripture, the Bible. And here you go. There you see it in big letters. This view foreshadowed Martin Luther's Reformation in the early 1500s. And this guy, very important, Luther is going to be famous now. Luther is somebody you're going to have to know everything about. You heard what I said about my super smart student who went to a college European history class, and the professor spent the entire lecture on Luther, and my student knew everything about Luther. This guy, Luther is going to be famous. Some of you already know this. If I was in class, I'd ask you what his relationship to the Bible was, and hopefully some of you would know that he translated into German. This guy translated it into English, and look at this. He died in 1384. So he did this over about 130 years before Luther translated the Bible into German. So he's way ahead of Luther. And his later followers were known as Lollards. Back before they changed the rules for AP European history, that was very important to know that. I have no idea what they were called, the Lollards. And here he is. He's given the priests. Now remember, during this time, you probably don't realize this, most people couldn't read and write. But generally your priests were educated. So he gave them a translation, the English priests, a translation of the Bible into their language. Luther is going to do the same thing in German. I bet most of you know why Luther's Bible is going to have more of an effect. It's going to be because of this new invention called the printing press. There's a Lollard prison cell. Of course, they got in trouble with the religious authorities. Cold retribution. Oh, I have all these stories. Again, as a matter of fact, let me see here. So Wycliffe managed to get himself in a lot of trouble. He was a Catholic priest, by the way. I just paused the recording and went and looked it up. You don't have to know all this stuff. I just love telling the good story. And he was a Catholic priest, known as a dissident Catholic priest. And of course, he got in trouble with the Catholic Church for teaching that necessarily the Pope's way wasn't the right way. But he died of a stroke. Afterwards, they, many years later, like 30 or 40 years after he died, they were burning all of his books. I think they were burning his books before he died. But at 30 or 40 years after he died, the Catholic Church commanded that his bones be drug up and burned and dumped into the river. And as I told you earlier, I like to read all the time and read. Maybe that was my AP World lecture. I frequently will quote something and kids will say, "Where'd you read that?" And I won't remember. But years ago, there was a story that I just found fascinating. There was this woman. It starts out sad. Her husband died. And so she went down to the funeral home. This is a true story. She went down to the funeral home to arrange his burial, and they had a funeral, and she buried him. And after he was in the ground, this other woman showed up and claimed to be married to him. And it turns out he was married to both. Now, I don't know if it was, you're not supposed to be married to two people. It's illegal. But anyway, they dug up his body. Now, I don't know how long he'd been dead. I don't think he'd been that long. I was fascinated to read that what they did was when they dug him up, they fingerprinted him. And apparently his fingerprints were in both wives' houses, which meant he had been, I don't know how one wife didn't know about the other, but these things happen, apparently, not often. And so when they did the fingerprints, it proved that he was married to both these women. And so once they were done, the word for digging a body up is exhumation. Once he was exhumed, they did this, they fingerprinted him. They were going to go bury him. And his first wife, or the one he was living with when he died, she said, hold on, I've changed my mind. They said, what do you mean? We need to put him back in the ground. She goes, no, I have the control over his body, and I've decided I want him cremated. And so they cremated him, and she took his ashes and flushed them down the toilet. And anyway, moving on here. I already told you that story. Oh, and there is the organization. Now look, I told you that I associated with this, with that spelling. There's going to be a lot of words in Euro that have more than one spelling, and it is possible I just spelled it wrong. But frequently these words are just translated differently. Even though this is English, this is Old English. So we're moving on. Johnhuss. Johnhuss actually shows up way more in European history than Wycliffe does. And I'm going to just let you write all this about him. I like to make lots of jokes about the nickname for his followers, but again, I'm going to leave that one alone. They were called the Hussites. So these are people. Now the thing about his is that he was in the Czech Republic, or what would become the Czech Republic, and it was nationalist. We're going to find a lot of that going on. These people rally around a religious leader, not necessarily because what they're teaching, but where they're from. And we're going to find out that was a big pull with Luther. The Catholic popes were generally Italian, not always, but generally. And when all the Catholic churches across Europe sent their money to the Catholic Church, it went down and was used to build fancy buildings. And Rome will definitely get in those fancy buildings because they're using people like Michelangelo and Da Vinci. We'll get into that when we do the Renaissance in the next chapter, chapter 12. But Luther was German, so a lot of the people followed him not because they wanted to be Protestants, but because they wanted to get back at what they saw as control of their religion by Italians, and they want a German leader. So this guy is kind of a Czech leader. All right, major important concept here. And I'm watching the clock here. We're 38 minutes into this lecture. This is pretty dang important. Anyway, I'm going to go for 42 minutes here. So that gives you 3 minutes for me to get in and say, go to YouTube. All right. So here's the thing about the Babylonian captivity. Back in the day, most people were named after biblical people. That's why there's so many people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I had a friend once, one of my best friends of my life, and when I met him, we called him Butch, but he told me, he says, my name is Jeduthan, J.D.U.T.H.E.N. And he would always tell the story, he goes, it's out of the Bible. His mother just went and looked in the Bible and found a word that she'd not, a name that nobody else used. He's the only person I've ever met named Jeduthan. And so the reason I'm telling you this is because the Bible and the stories from the Bible was one thing these people all had in common. Now, you guys probably have TV shows you watch. When my kids were still at home, I came home one day and they were watching Japanese anime. I'm like, what in the world are you watching? But you probably have a lot of TV shows or video games that you share, and you can make jokes. You can have quotes from those games and movies that your friends will get, and so nobody else will get them. And so here's my point. The thing how about this? If you know that somebody not very powerful is going up against somebody much more powerful than them, you will say it is a blank and blank story. Now, if I was to ask you that in class, I think most of you would get it right. What's the story from the Bible? Some kid going up against a giant, David and Goliath. If you get that, you'll understand here, you'll understand what I'm saying here. And so the Babylonian captivity was something that had happened way back in, the Old Testament of the Bible. And so it's just a famous story where the Jews were carried off to captivity in Babylon. I just talked about that just today in my AP World lecture I just recorded. So here's what happened. I'm going to go ahead and click, although we're going to run out of time. So there's a struggle between the Pope and the French king. And what happened was it led to the election of a French Pope who set up his leadership in Avignon, France. Okay, now, popes are supposed to live in Rome. Okay, I'm going to say that again. They're supposed to live in Rome. So here there is a pope living in Avignon, France. And there were 7 different popes who lived there. But the Catholic Church didn't want the popes to live there. I don't know that what he wrote here is right. The French king was powerful, so he basically just said, hey, the Pope's going to live in my country. And so the Italians elected another Pope. Okay? All right. So this lecture, I really like these lectures. They're leaving stuff out here. And so I'm going to run a little over my time here. What eventually is going to happen is it's the French king that's doing this, right? And so what happens is the Catholic Church doesn't like being bossed around by the French king, so they pick another pope. So now you have 2 popes. There's a pope living in Avignon and a pope living in Rome, and they both excommunicated each other. I'm running out of time, so I can't explain to you what excommunication means, but it's pretty serious. A Catholic doesn't want it. And so eventually the church decided, let's get rid of both those popes and pick another. And what happened was the popes that they were telling to leave weren't leaving. And so at one point there was 3 different people that claimed to be pope, and they all had legitimate reasons to be considered the pope. Imagine, if you're a Catholic, how confused you are by the idea there's more than one pope. I believe there might have been actually 4 at one point, but that question is not going to be on the quiz. But here's what this is, why it's called the Babylonian captivity. This is the Italian Catholics basically saying, hey, they've taken our pope and they've trapped him over there in France, just like the Jews were taken away from Israel and kept in captivity in Babylon. And so they call this the Babylonian captivity. There were no Babylonians here, and I don't know how much you'd consider this, the Pope being a captive. I mean, look at the palace. It's pretty nice. But anyway, this is the story of the Babylonian captivity. Oh, good. So we're done with that, and we're going to stop the lecture for Thursday.